In 1970, 5 Scottish fishing boats worked the waters off East Anglia and landed 60 crans of herring between them. 60 years earlier, the same stretch of North Sea coastline had landed 60 million in a single day. The port behind those numbers was Great Yarmouth, Norfolk. Once wealthier than every English town except York, Bristol, and Newcastle. Its entire fortune built on one fish, but by 1970 the fishery was finished. Today, several of the town's neighbourhoods rank among the most deprived in England. The land Great Yarmouth stands on did not exist for most of recorded history. Around 1,000 years ago, a sandbank formed at the point where the River Yar met the North Sea. It was not much to speak of. An unstable spit of shingle and silt between the Bure and the Yar, good for nothing except drying fishing nets. Fishermen, some accounts suggest from the Cinque Ports of Kent, began using it seasonally, spreading their nets on the bare ground and working the autumn herring run as the shoals migrated south through the North Sea. By 1086, the Domesday Book recorded a small permanent settlement on this unlikely scrap of coastline. Around 70 burgesses and 24 fishermen, a population probably numbering from fewer than 500 people. The entry lists 3 separate landowners, a sign of a place still being carved up rather than a settled town. In 1208, King John granted this settlement its founding charter, giving it the right to hold a market, to govern itself, and to formalise the autumn herring fair that had already drawn buyers from across northern Europe. The rent the town owed the crown was not paid in silver. It was paid in fish, 100 herring, baked into 24 pasties, delivered annually to the king. An entire borough's obligation to the crown, settled in pastry. The medieval town that grew from this charter was unlike anything else in England. Between the river and the sea, crammed onto the narrow strip of the original sandbank, a grid of over 140 lanes developed, running east to west between 3 main streets. These were the rows, and most of them measured barely 90 to 150 centimetres across, narrow enough that a person could touch both walls at once by stretching out their arms. A 1618 town ordinance required every door to swing inward, after repeated injuries from doors opening outward into the passage. Constables were empowered to nail shut any offending door. The fine was 5 shillings. Standard horse-drawn carts could not fit. The town developed its own vehicle instead, the troll cart, roughly a metre wide with its wheels tucked beneath the body, designed for passages that no other English town would have tolerated. The herring made all of this possible, and the herring made it rich. By 1332, the lay subsidy rolls showed Great Yarmouth raising more money than every English town except York, Bristol, and Newcastle. A fishing settlement on a sandbank, barely 250 years old, among the 4 wealthiest places in the kingdom. St. Nicholas Church, consecrated in 1119, was built by what were almost certainly royal masons, given the quality of the work. What they produced was, by most measures, the largest parish church in England by floor area. Not a cathedral, a parish church bigger than most English cathedrals, standing in a town that most English people today would associate with seaside amusement arcades. The town's coat of arms fused 3 herring tails with the 3 lion heads of the Royal Arms of England, granted after Yarmouth ships fought at the Battle of Sluys in 1340. A fishing town's emblem merged with a king's. That wealth did not go uncontested. The Cinque Ports of Kent, Dover, Hastings, Sandwich, Hythe and Romney held ancient charter rights to police the herring fair, sending their own bailiffs to administer justice on Yarmouth's ground. Yarmouth's townsmen deeply resented being governed on their own soil by outsiders from the south coast. The result was one of medieval England's longest civic feuds, stretching across 400 to 500 years. In 1297, Yarmouth and Cinque Port's contingents of a combined royal fleet, supposedly sailing together against France, turned on each other instead. Yarmouth lost at least 25 ships. A brass horn, sounded each year to formally open the fair under the Cinque Port's ancient privilege, still survives in New Romney, Kent. A relic of a jurisdictional war fought over fish. The same wealth concealed a vulnerability. The harbour mouth kept silting shut, and every time it blocked, trade drained to the rival anchorage at Lowestoft. By the early 1500s, Yarmouth had slipped from 4th to roughly 20th among English towns. The problem was not properly solved until the 1560s, when a Dutch engineer named Joas Johnson re-engineered the piers. The town recovered, but the real transformation was still 3 centuries away. In 1844, the railway arrived at Great Yarmouth and dissolved the fishery's oldest structural limit overnight. Before the railway, demand had been capped not by how many fish were in the sea, but by how quickly the catch could be cured before it spoiled. Herring landed one morning on the Yarmouth fish wharf could now be on sale in Manchester or London by the following day. In 1835, a Yarmouth man named John Bishop had developed the bloater, a whole herring, ungutted, lightly salted and cold smoked. Milder than the older, heavily cured red herring that had been Yarmouth's signature product for centuries. The red herring, incidentally, is the origin of the English idiom. It was tough enough to keep for up to a year, and its pungent smell made it useful for training hunting dogs, and later for distracting them. By the 1860s, with steam drifters replacing sail and the railway network expanding, the herring industry was no longer an artisanal fishery. It was an industrial operation. And with that transformation came one of the most remarkable seasonal labour migrations in British history. Every autumn from the mid-1800s until roughly 1960, thousands of Scottish women followed the herring fleet down Britain's east coast, from Shetland to Great Yarmouth, to gut, salt and pack the catch by hand. At the industry's peak, around 10,000 seasonal workers arrived in Yarmouth each autumn. Roughly 6,000 of them were Scottish women, the herring girls. They travelled south in special trains, up to 20 a week at the start of the season, carrying their belongings in a wooden chest called a kist. They were billeted 3 to a room in small terraced houses along the seafront. Landladies papered the walls with newspaper before the women arrived, because the smell of fish would linger for weeks after they left. The work was brutal by any standard. Teams of 3, 2 gutters and 1 packer, stood at long wooden troughs called farlins and processed fish from early morning until evening, sometimes as late as midnight if boats came in after dark. 12 to 15-hour days were standard during peak weeks. Before starting, the women bound their fingers in strips of cloth torn from flour sacks to protect against the short, razor-sharp gutting knife, the Q-tag. Cuts were routine. Salt in an open wound was constant. A skilled gutter could process 40 to 60 herring a minute. A team of 3 could fill roughly 30 barrels in a single day, with around 700 herring packed into each barrel. Pay was by the barrel. In the early 1900s, a woman's take-home for the entire autumn season might be £10 or £12. Sundays were the only day off. The women dressed in their best clothes and attended church, sometimes at services conducted in Gaelic by visiting ministers who followed the same migration south. Between gutting sessions, most were skilled knitters of the traditional Gansey jumper, working the patterns on their needles while waiting for the next boat to land. Despite the harshness, multiple oral histories from the period describe gutting as a desirable job by the standards of the day. It paid comparatively well. It offered a freedom of travel and independence unusual for working women in early 20th century Britain, and it built a community culture sustained by singing while working, shared lodging, and a fierce collective identity that carried from Shetland to Suffolk and back again each year. The herring girls' annual migration effectively ended around 1960, as refrigeration reduced demand for hand-salted, barreled herring, and the declining catch gave curers less and less reason to hire seasonal crews. In November 1936, around 3,000 of these women staged an unofficial strike on the Yarmouth quayside, halting the industry, demanding £1 a barrel for their labour. Rare surviving newsreel footage from British Path captures the scene directly. The herring girls were the workforce behind the industry's greatest years, and those years fell into a remarkably narrow window. On the 23rd of October, 1907, roughly 60 million herring were landed at the Great Yarmouth fish wharf in a single day. Additional fish had to be diverted to Grimsby because Yarmouth had no capacity left. The 1913 season surpassed everything. Around 1,650 vessels fished out of Yarmouth that autumn, roughly 264 English-registered drifters, alongside 742 Scottish boats. Total landings came to approximately 824,000 crans, a cran being a specific herring measure of roughly 37.5 imperial gallons, holding somewhere between 700 and 1,300 fish, depending on size. By conservative estimate, somewhere between 800 million and 900 million individual herring passed through Yarmouth in a single 3-month autumn season. 87 to 90% of the total catch was exported, overwhelmingly to Germany and Russia. The harbour was so packed with boats that, so the accounts go, a person could cross from one bank to the other simply by stepping from deck to deck. The figures were large enough to reassure everyone in the industry that the herring stock was inexhaustible. If the 1913 season had stopped there, if the following year had gone ahead as normal, this would be a very different story. The outbreak of war in August 1914 meant there was no herring season at all. The war did not merely remove men and boats temporarily, it permanently severed Yarmouth's 2 largest export markets, Germany and Russia, at the precise moment those markets were absorbing 90% of the catch. Yarmouth itself came under direct attack. A Zeppelin raid on the 19th of January 1915 made it one of the first places in England bombed from the air. The fishing fleet was requisitioned for minesweeping and anti-submarine patrol, and a large proportion of the male fishing workforce enlisted. Had a normal 1914 season gone ahead, the herring stock would very likely have collapsed decades sooner. The war's disruption of fishing may have accidentally bought the industry an extra 40 years of life, even as it permanently destroyed the markets the whole trade depended on. The same event that saved the fish killed the fishery. When the fishery resumed in 1919, landings reached 453,458 crans. Respectable, but a marked step down from 1913, and the beginning of a decline from which the industry never fully recovered. The story of this channel is the story of places shaped by forces larger than themselves. If that is a story worth following, the subscribe button is one click away. By the 1930s, the Yarmouth fleet had shrunk to just 87 drifters and 17 combined drifter trawlers. The old export markets had not come back. Then the Second World War arrived, and Great Yarmouth's position on England's east coast made it one of the most heavily bombed towns in the country outside the major cities. It sat on the flight path of German bombers crossing the North Sea, and pilots could jettison unused ordnance on the town before turning for home. The statistics are concentrated and precise. In 1941 alone, roughly 800 high-explosive bombs fell on the town, killing 109 people. Over the full course of the war, 938 high-explosive bombs were recorded on the county borough of Great Yarmouth. 1,427 houses damaged beyond repair and demolished. 172 other premises destroyed. St. Nicholas Church, the largest parish church in England, the building funded by centuries of herring wealth, was completely gutted by fire. In 1940, it was not rebuilt until 1961. In May 1943, a single bomb on Sefton House killed 26 servicewomen of the Auxiliary Territorial Service. It is reported to be the single largest loss of British servicewomen of the entire war. The Rows, that grid of medieval lanes built by the herring trade, suffered severe bomb damage. What the Luftwaffe started, post-war slum clearance finished. Most of what survived was demolished. Around 80 rows remain today. Row 111 House, maintained by English Heritage, is presented as it stood in 1942. 3 families had been living there. A cathedral built by fish, burned by bombs. A street plan shaped by herring, erased by high explosives and planning committees. The post-war herring fishery resumed, but it never recovered. The stock had already been overfished going in, and renewed effort with more efficient vessels kept pressure too high for regeneration. By 1960, catches had fallen to just 2 to 3% of the 1913 peak. In 1954, a reduction factory was built to convert surplus herring into fish oil and cattle feed rather than food. The old market logic had broken down entirely. In 1963, the last Yarmouth steam drifter was sold. In 1968, the fishery closed for good. In 1970, 5 Scottish boats made one final attempt and landed 60 crans between them. In 1977, the North Sea herring fishery as a whole was placed under an international moratorium after stocks collapsed catastrophically. The ban did not so much end the fishery as confirm that it could not come back on any commercially meaningful scale. The herring, once called the Silver Darling, had gone. What filled the gap arrived almost immediately, and arrived on the same waterfront. North Sea gas exploration began off the Norfolk coast in the late 1960s, just as the herring fleet was disappearing. Great Yarmouth, with a river harbour capable of giving supply vessels round-the-clock access, was perfectly positioned. Within a decade, the same quays that had handled steam drifters were loading supply runs for gas platforms. The town spent more than 50 years as an offshore energy base. Tourism became the other pillar, worth roughly £600 million a year to the local economy today. Since the mid-2010s, offshore wind has added a third transformation, with Equinor, Vattenfall, and Scottish Power Renewables all operating or building from the Yarmouth quayside. In 2025, the facility was rebranded the Port of East Anglia. Not every trace of the old industry vanished in 1968. A handful of small firms in Yarmouth continued smoking, curing, and selling herring products, bloaters and kippers, long after the fishery closed. They used imported herring, mostly Norwegian, but the smoking techniques and the curing houses were the same ones that had been in continuous use for generations. In 2018, HS Fishing, Yarmouth's last commercial smokehouse, closed its doors. With it went what may have been the final link in a continuous local herring curing tradition running back centuries. One of the town's neighbourhoods, Great Yarmouth 006D, now ranks 37th most deprived out of 33,755 nationally. The Time and Tide Museum on Blackfriars Road, housed in a converted Victorian curing works, opened in 2003. It sits opposite surviving sections of the medieval town wall, 11 of the original 18 turrets still standing, among the most complete such walls in England. The Lydia Eve, the last surviving steam drifter in the world, is usually moored near Haven Bridge in the centre of Yarmouth. Inside the museum, a full-scale recreation of one of the rows allows visitors to walk through the kind of passage that once held the entire population of one of England's wealthiest towns. The herring are still in the North Sea. Small-scale longshore fishing survives on the Norfolk coast, a handful of boats landing catches that would not have filled a single barrel on the 1913 wharf. 5 Scottish boats and 60 crans. That was the final catch in 1970, on the same coastline that had once landed 60 million in a day. The wind turbines turning on the horizon are visible from the same beach where the first fishermen dried their nets 1,000 years ago. If this story held something worth remembering, there are others like it on this channel. The next one is already on screen.